They say the things we lose often find their way back when the time is right. But no one in Silver Pine Lake could have imagined that a simple gold ring, buried beneath ice and forgotten for decades, would change the life of a homeless veteran and his loyal dog forever. The first light of January spread across the frozen shoreline like pale silver silk. A cold wind drifted over the lake, carrying the scent of pine, snow, and distant wood smoke. Caleb Mercer pulled his worn canvas jacket tighter around his shoulders as he followed the narrow path beside the water. At his side trotted Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose amber eyes seemed to notice things the rest of the world overlooked. The lake lay silent beneath a thin sheet of ice, reflecting the pale morning sky like polished glass. Then Ranger stopped. His ears lifted. His body grew still. Without a sound, he stepped toward an old wooden dock half buried in snow and began pawing gently at the frozen ground. Caleb watched for a moment before kneeling beside him. Beneath a layer of ice and gravel, something glimmered. He brushed away the frost and lifted a small gold ring into the morning light. Inside the band were 4 simple words engraved with remarkable care. "Come back to the lake." Caleb stared at the inscription while Ranger remained unusually quiet. Neither of them knew it yet, but the lake had just opened a door that had been waiting 40 years to be found. The ring felt strangely warm despite the winter cold. Caleb turned it over in his gloved hand as the morning wind whispered across the frozen lake. The engraving stayed fixed in his mind. "Come back to the lake." It did not sound like a romantic message. It sounded like a request, almost a promise waiting for someone to fulfill it. Ranger remained beside the dock, watching the still water with unusual focus. His ears twitched once toward the distant shoreline before he finally turned back toward town. Caleb slipped the ring carefully into his jacket pocket and followed. Silver Pine Lake was the kind of place people passed through without noticing. A single main street, a gas station, a diner with fogged windows, a hardware store that smelled of cedar and old paint. Yet beneath its quiet surface lived generations of stories. Caleb knew that because towns like these always carried memories longer than cities did. By midday, gray clouds had gathered overhead, softening the sunlight into a pale glow. Caleb stopped inside the local diner to warm up. Ranger settled near the booth while the scent of coffee and fresh biscuits drifted through the room. A bulletin board hung beside the front register, crowded with fishing photos, church announcements, and yellowing newspaper clippings. Caleb might have walked past it if Ranger had not suddenly lifted his head. The dog stared toward the wall, not barking, not growling, simply watching. Caleb followed his gaze. One photograph near the corner caught his attention. It showed a smiling young couple standing beside the lake decades earlier. The photograph had faded with time, but one detail remained unmistakably clear. The woman wore the exact ring now resting inside Caleb's pocket. He rose immediately and stepped closer. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten caption. Eleanor Whitmore and James Whitmore. Summer Festival, 1984. The name stirred curiosity throughout the diner. When Caleb asked about her, the waitress smiled softly. "Everyone knows Miss Eleanor. She still lives up on Cedar Bluff Road. Has not missed a Sunday church service in 40 years. Caleb thanked her and left before the afternoon snow arrived. The drive to Cedar Bluff wound through tall pine trees dusted with fresh powder. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the forest pass by. As they climbed higher, the lake appeared below like a sheet of silver glass stretching toward the horizon. Eleanor's house stood alone near the edge of a ridge overlooking the water. White shutters, stone chimney, a weather vane shaped like a loon turning slowly above the roof. It looked peaceful, yet something about it felt frozen in time. Caleb knocked gently. Several moments passed before the door opened. The woman who answered appeared smaller than he expected. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. A blue wool cardigan rested over her shoulders. Her eyes carried the quiet weight of many years. Caleb introduced himself and reached into his pocket. The moment she saw the ring, all color seemed to leave her face. Her hand moved to her chest. Not from fear, from disbelief. She stared at the gold band as if she had suddenly stepped backward through time. For several long seconds, she could not speak. Even the grandfather clock behind her seemed louder than before. Ranger sat quietly at Caleb's side, his amber eyes fixed on the woman. Then Eleanor reached forward with trembling fingers and touched the ring. A tear formed in the corner of her eye. Not falling, simply waiting. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you find this?" Caleb glanced toward the distant lake visible through the trees. Something told him this was only the beginning of a story that had been waiting 40 years to be told. Snow began falling outside as Eleanor slowly stepped aside and invited Caleb into the house. Warmth greeted them immediately. The scent of cedar, old books, and cinnamon drifted through the air. A fire crackled softly inside a stone hearth, casting golden light across family photographs arranged on shelves worn smooth by time. Ranger entered quietly and settled near the fireplace, though his alert eyes continued watching every detail around him. Eleanor held the ring carefully in both hands as if afraid it might disappear again. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. The silence inside the room felt sacred, like the pause before a prayer. Finally, she lowered herself into a chair beside the window overlooking the lake. The gray water stretched beyond the glass, calm and distant beneath the falling snow. 40 years, she whispered. I looked for it for 40 years. Caleb sat across from her without speaking. Experience had taught him that some stories arrived slowly. They needed patience before they could breathe. Eleanor smiled faintly through tears that never quite fell. James gave me this ring the summer before we were married. Her fingers traced the worn gold band. He was never a wealthy man. He built things with his hands. Docks, cabins, boathouses, whatever people needed. But he saved for months to buy this ring. She looked toward the lake again. The day he gave it to me, he brought me out on a small boat just before sunset. He said the lake looked like heaven when the light touched the water. A soft laugh escaped her. I told him he sounded like a poet. He said he only sounded that way because he was nervous. Caleb found himself smiling. Ranger lifted his head slightly, listening to her voice. Years later, Eleanor continued. We came back to the lake during the summer festival. The docks were crowded. Music was playing. Families were everywhere. Her expression softened into memory. Somewhere that evening, the ring slipped from my finger. We searched until midnight. James even hired divers a week later. She shook her head slowly. We never found it. The room fell quiet again. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the window like white feathers. Then something changed in her expression. A deeper sadness emerged beneath the nostalgia. 1 year later, James disappeared. Caleb looked up. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on the lake. His truck was found near the northern shoreline. There were footprints leading toward the old forest trail. Her voice lowered. But no one ever discovered where he went. Caleb felt a chill unrelated to the weather. Ranger slowly stood and walked toward the window. His ears tilted forward toward the distant water. People believed different things, Eleanor said softly. Some thought he left. Some thought he got lost in the mountains. Others created stories because that is what small towns do. She paused. But I never believed any of them. Caleb studied her face. What did you believe? Eleanor's fingers tightened gently around the ring. I believed he wanted me to find something. The fire crackled. The grandfather clock ticked steadily somewhere down the hallway. Then Eleanor opened a small drawer beside her chair and removed an old photograph. It showed a large wooden lodge standing beside the lake, surrounded by towering pines. Time had faded the colors, but the building remained beautiful. She handed the photograph to Caleb. 3 weeks before he disappeared, James bought that lodge. Caleb examined the image carefully. Something about it felt important. Not because of the building itself, but because of the expression on James's face. The man looked excited, hopeful, like someone preparing for a future he could already see. He told me there was a secret hidden there, Eleanor whispered. But before he could show me what it was, he vanished. At that exact moment, Ranger stepped away from the window and walked directly to the photograph. The dog stared at it for several seconds before releasing one low whine. Not fear, not warning, recognition. And for the first time that day, Caleb felt certain the ring had not returned by accident. The photograph stayed in Caleb's mind long after he left Eleanor's house that evening. Snow continued falling across Silver Pine Lake, turning the world soft and silent beneath a blanket of white. The road curved along the shoreline as twilight settled over the water. Ranger sat quietly beside him, but every few minutes the dog glanced toward the dark outline of the distant forest. It was the same look Caleb had learned to trust during difficult years long ago. A look that meant Ranger sensed something waiting ahead. The next morning arrived cold and bright. Sunlight spilled across the frozen lake, transforming the snow into a field of diamonds. Eleanor was already waiting when Caleb pulled into her driveway. She stood on the porch wrapped in a thick wool coat, holding a weathered leather folder beneath one arm. The years seemed lighter on her face than they had the day before. For the first time, hope had replaced uncertainty. Inside the folder were old maps, property records, and handwritten notes that James had left behind. Most were ordinary. Repair estimates, lumber orders, sketches of docks and cabins. But one page had been folded separately from the rest. On it was a rough drawing of the lodge surrounded by pine trees. Near the lower corner, James had written 6 simple words. Some doors open only when returned. Caleb studied the sentence several times. It felt connected to the ring somehow, though he could not explain why. Eleanor noticed his expression. That was his handwriting, she said softly. He wrote it a month before he disappeared. Ranger suddenly stood and pressed his nose against the map, his attention fixed on a narrow peninsula extending into the lake. Caleb looked closer. The lodge sat there, isolated from the rest of the shoreline, nearly forgotten. Has anyone lived there recently? Caleb asked. Eleanor shook her head. Not for decades. After James vanished, I could not bring myself to go back. Her eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the water. People still talk about the place. They say lights sometimes appear in the windows at night. Caleb smiled politely. Small towns often created stories where answers were missing. Yet something about the lodge continued pulling at him. By late morning they were driving north along a winding road that hugged the shoreline. Pine trees towered overhead, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The lake appeared and disappeared through gaps in the forest like glimpses of another world. After nearly 30 minutes, the road ended at an old iron gate. Rust covered the hinges. Vines wrapped around the fence posts despite the winter cold. Beyond it, a narrow gravel path disappeared into the trees. Caleb stepped out of the truck. The air smelled of pine resin and frozen earth. Ranger immediately moved ahead, ears alert. They followed the path through the woods until the trees finally opened. The lodge stood before them. Even after years of neglect, it was beautiful. Massive cedar beams framed the structure. Stone chimneys rose toward the pale sky. Large windows faced the lake, reflecting sunlight across the snow-covered shoreline. Time had weathered the wood, but the building still possessed a quiet dignity. A place built to last. Caleb felt something unexpected as he stared at it. Not excitement. Recognition. As though the lodge had been waiting. Ranger trotted forward onto the wide front porch. Then he stopped. His body became completely still. The dog lowered his head and listened. Seconds passed. The forest remained silent. No birds. No wind. No movement. Then Ranger slowly turned toward the front door and released a single low whine. Caleb approached. Hanging beside the entrance was an old brass key hidden beneath decades of dust. He looked down at the ring resting in his hand and noticed something he had somehow missed before. Engraved along the inner edge was a tiny symbol. The exact same symbol carved into the brass key. And suddenly James Whitmore's strange message no longer sounded like a memory. It sounded like an instruction. Caleb stood motionless on the porch while the winter wind drifted through the towering pines. The brass key felt unexpectedly heavy in his hand. Beside him, Ranger remained fixed on the front door, his ears angled forward with complete concentration. It was the same posture he used when listening for something hidden beneath layers of sound. Caleb glanced at the symbol engraved on the ring, and then at the identical mark carved into the old key. The connection was impossible to ignore. Slowly, he inserted the key into the weathered lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then a soft click echoed through the silence. The door opened inward with a long creak, releasing the scent of cedar, dust, and forgotten years. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale beams across the empty lodge. The interior was larger than Caleb expected. Stone fireplaces stood at opposite ends of the great room. Exposed timber beams stretched overhead. Tables and chairs remained exactly where they had been left decades earlier. Dust covered every surface, yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt paused, as though someone had intended to return at any moment. Ranger stepped inside first. His nails clicked softly across the hardwood floor. Caleb followed, closing the door behind them. The silence inside carried a strange weight. Not uncomfortable, just watchful. They spent the afternoon exploring room after room. Bedrooms overlooked the lake. A library occupied the second floor. Old photographs lined the hallway walls. Many showed James Whitmore smiling beside guests gathered on the dock during summers long gone. Everywhere Caleb looked, he found evidence of dreams interrupted but never erased. As daylight faded, golden light spilled across the frozen lake outside the windows. Snowflakes drifted through the air like tiny lanterns. Caleb built a small fire in the main fireplace using dry wood stored beside the hearth. The flames crackled warmly, pushing back the evening chill. Ranger settled near the fire, though his attention never fully relaxed. Several times he lifted his head toward the floor beneath them. Each time Caleb noticed, the dog would lower his ears and continue listening. Hours passed. Darkness settled over the lake. The lodge glowed softly in the firelight while shadows moved across the timber walls. Caleb sat at an old desk reviewing the documents Eleanor had given him. Maps, notes, property records. Yet none of them explained what James had meant by his hidden secret. Around 9 o'clock, Ranger abruptly stood. His entire body stiffened. Caleb immediately looked up. The dog was staring toward the center of the great room. Not barking, not growling, listening. The fire popped softly behind them. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Beyond that, silence. Then Caleb heard it. A faint sound beneath the floorboards. Thump. He froze. Several seconds passed. Thump. The sound returned. Soft. Rhythmic. Almost mechanical. Ranger moved closer to the center of the room. His ears remained perfectly still. Thump. Caleb set down the papers and walked toward the sound. The floor appeared completely normal. Wide cedar planks worn smooth by time. Nothing unusual. Yet the sound continued. Steady. Patient. As though something deep beneath the lodge was keeping time. Ranger stopped near an old braided rug positioned between two stone columns. The dog lowered his nose to the floor and released a quiet whine. Caleb rolled back the rug. Underneath, the wood appeared slightly different from the surrounding boards. Darker, less worn. He knelt and brushed away years of dust. Along one edge, barely visible beneath the grain, was a narrow seam. His pulse quickened. Carefully he pressed against the floorboard. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Then his eyes drifted toward the ring resting in his pocket. The inscription. The matching symbol. The message James had left behind. Some doors open only when returned. As the realization settled over him, the rhythmic sound beneath the lodge stopped completely. The sudden silence felt even louder than the noise itself. Ranger slowly looked up at Caleb. And somewhere beneath the floor, something had just acknowledged their presence. The fire burned low as midnight settled over the lake. Beyond the tall windows, moonlight stretched across the frozen water in silver ribbons, turning the shoreline into a landscape that felt suspended between memory and dream. Caleb remained kneeling beside the strange seam in the floor, while Ranger stood watch nearby. The silence beneath the lodge continued. Whatever had been creating the rhythmic sound had stopped the moment Caleb noticed it. Yet somehow that made the mystery feel even more alive. He reached into his pocket and removed the gold ring. The metal caught the firelight, casting a warm glow across his palm. Carefully he examined the engraved symbol again. The shape resembled a compass rose, though one section appeared slightly elongated. Not decoration. A marker. A clue. Caleb glanced back at the darker section of flooring. Along the edge of one plank, he noticed a tiny brass fitting almost invisible beneath decades of dust. It carried the same symbol. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he pressed the ring against the fitting. Nothing happened at first. Then a faint click echoed below. Ranger immediately lifted his head. The old floor shifted slightly beneath Caleb's hand. He pushed gently. A concealed panel moved inward, revealing a narrow, iron handle hidden beneath the wood. For several seconds he simply stared. The mechanism had remained untouched for decades, waiting for a ring lost beneath a lake and a man who had never known James Whitmore. The realization sent a chill through him. Gripping the handle firmly, he pulled. The hidden section of floor rose slowly, releasing a breath of cool air from below. Beneath it lay a staircase descending into darkness. Ranger approached immediately, his nose testing the air. There was no fear in his posture. Only curiosity. Caleb grabbed a lantern from the fireplace mantel and carefully started downward. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath his boots. The air smelled of cedar, stone, and age. After descending 15 feet, he reached a small, underground room built directly beneath the lodge. He stopped in surprise. This was not a vault. There were no piles of money, no gold bars, no forgotten treasure. Instead, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of journals filled them. Beside the shelves stood filing cabinets, maps, photographs, blueprints, and carefully organized boxes labeled in James Whitmore's handwriting. Everything had been preserved with extraordinary care. It looked less like a hiding place and more like a life's work. Caleb slowly walked forward. Ranger followed close behind. On a large table in the center of the room sat a leather journal. Unlike the others, it was not covered in dust, as though it had been meant to be opened first. The cover bore a simple inscription: "For whoever finds this." Caleb opened the journal carefully. The first page contained only a single sentence. "If you are reading this, then the lake finally returned what it borrowed." His breath caught. The words felt impossible. James could not have known where the ring would end up. Yet somehow he had written exactly what had happened. Caleb turned the page. The next entries revealed something even more astonishing. For nearly 20 years, James had quietly purchased neglected properties around Silver Pine Lake. Old cabins, abandoned docks, empty shoreline lots, places nobody wanted. Instead of selling them, he restored them and placed them into a private trust. Not for profit, not for personal wealth, but to protect the lake and support families struggling to remain in the community. Detailed maps covered the walls showing dozens of locations connected through the same project. Caleb realized he was standing inside the blueprint of a dream far larger than a single lodge. Then Ranger moved suddenly toward the far corner of the room. The dog stopped beside an old wooden cabinet and released a soft whine. Caleb walked over and opened it. Inside rested a sealed envelope. Across the front, written in steady handwriting, were two names: Eleanor Whitmore, and the person who returns the ring. Caleb stared at the envelope while the lantern light flickered across the room. Somewhere above them, the lodge settled softly against the winter wind. And for the first time, he began to understand that James Whitmore had not hidden his greatest secret underground. He had hidden it in the future. The lantern flame flickered gently as Caleb stared at the envelope resting inside the cabinet. For several moments he did not move. The underground room seemed to hold its breath around him. Shelves of journals surrounded him like silent witnesses, preserving decades of hopes, plans, and unanswered questions. Ranger sat quietly nearby, his amber eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lantern. Outside, somewhere beyond layers of stone, timber, and snow, the winter wind drifted across Silver Pine Lake. Yet down here, time felt different. Slower, almost sacred. Carefully, Caleb lifted the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age but remained perfectly preserved. He could see Eleanor's name written first, followed by the words that had brought an unexpected tightness to his chest. And the person who returns the ring. The handwriting was steady, intentional, as though James Whitmore had known this moment would one day arrive. Caleb broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The first lines were addressed to Eleanor. His eyes moved slowly across the page. James wrote about love, gratitude, and the years they had shared together. He described summer mornings on the lake, the sound of loons at sunrise, the smell of cedar after rain, small memories that often outlast grand achievements. Caleb could almost hear the man's voice through the ink. Then the letter shifted. The words became more personal, more urgent. James explained that he had discovered a serious illness shortly before creating the trust and purchasing the properties around the lake. Rather than burden Eleanor with fear, he chose to spend his remaining strength building something that would continue helping people long after he was gone. His disappearance had not been a mystery after all. Months after receiving his diagnosis, he had quietly traveled to a medical center several states away. He wanted Eleanor to remember him by the lake he loved, not by the limitations that followed. Tears blurred Caleb's vision for a moment. Decades of uncertainty had hidden a truth far gentler than the stories people had invented. Then he reached the section written specifically for whoever found the ring. Caleb's pulse quickened. The words felt impossibly personal despite being written many years before. If you are reading this, then life has carried you to this place for a reason. The lake returned the ring because some promises are stronger than time. I do not know your name. I do not know your story. But I know this. Anyone honest enough to return what was never theirs already understands the purpose of everything I built. Caleb lowered the page briefly. The room felt warmer somehow. The fire of the lantern danced softly against the walls. Ranger remained still beside him, listening. He continued reading. James explained that the trust was never meant to create wealth. It existed to preserve hope. The lodge, the cabins, the shoreline properties, and every asset connected to the project had one purpose: to provide housing, support, and opportunity for people facing difficult seasons of life. Veterans, widows, families struggling to start over, people who simply needed a second chance. Caleb swallowed hard. Every word felt directed straight at him. Then he reached the final paragraph. There, attached to the letter, was a legal document signed decades earlier. A succession clause. If Eleanor could no longer oversee the trust, ownership and stewardship of the entire project would pass to the individual who returned the ring and completed the journey to the lodge. Caleb stared at the signature below. The room fell completely silent. Even Ranger seemed frozen. James Whitmore had not hidden money beneath the lodge. He had hidden a future. And somehow, against every law of probability, that future had just landed in the hands of a homeless veteran who had only wanted to do the right thing. The sunrise that followed seemed different somehow. Golden light spilled across Silver Pine Lake, melting ribbons of mist that drifted above the water like quiet spirits returning home. Caleb stood on the lodge porch with a mug of coffee warming his hands while Ranger sat beside him, watching the shoreline. The events of the previous night still felt impossible. The hidden room, the journals, the letter, the trust. Every piece of it seemed too perfectly connected to be chance, yet the evidence rested only a few feet away inside the lodge. By mid-morning, Caleb drove back to Eleanor's house carrying the letter and documents. Snow sparkled beneath the winter sun as he followed the familiar road along the lake. When Eleanor opened the door, she immediately sensed something had changed. Caleb saw it in her eyes before a single word was spoken. They sat together beside the fireplace where the journey had truly begun. Ranger rested quietly at Eleanor's feet, while Caleb carefully unfolded the letter. As he read James's words aloud, the room grew silent. Eleanor listened without interruption. Sometimes she smiled softly. Sometimes she closed her eyes. Once, a tear slipped down her cheek when she heard a memory she had not spoken aloud in decades. When Caleb reached the section explaining James's illness and his decision to leave quietly, Eleanor pressed both hands against her heart. Not from sadness alone, but from relief. 40 years of unanswered questions slowly dissolved into understanding. The burden she had carried for nearly half her life finally loosened its grip. For several minutes after Caleb finished reading, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled gently. Outside, sunlight shimmered across the snow-covered landscape. At last Eleanor looked toward the lake visible through her window. "I always knew there was more to the story," she whispered. "I just never imagined he would still be finding ways to surprise me." Caleb handed her the succession document. She studied the signature carefully before smiling. "This sounds exactly like James." Caleb raised an eyebrow. Eleanor laughed softly. He never believed people should be judged by what they owned. He believed they should be judged by what they returned. Her eyes shifted toward the ring resting on the table between them. That is why he trusted whoever brought it back. Over the following weeks, lawyers, trustees, and old records confirmed everything contained in the hidden room. The trust existed exactly as James had described. The lodge, the shoreline cabins, several acres of protected forest, rental cottages, community properties. Together they represented a remarkable legacy built quietly over many years. Yet what surprised Caleb most was not the value. It was the purpose behind it. Every document reflected kindness. Every decision pointed toward helping others. One afternoon, as snow began to melt from the pines, the trust board gathered inside the lodge for a formal meeting. Several members had known James personally. Others had only heard stories. All of them reviewed the succession clause carefully. The process lasted hours. When it ended, the chairman stood and extended his hand across the table. The room grew still. Caleb glanced toward Ranger, who sat calmly beside the fireplace as though he had expected this outcome from the beginning. Then the chairman smiled. "According to James Whitmore's wishes, and with the unanimous support of the board, stewardship of the trust and the lodge now passes to you." The words settled gently into the room. No applause followed. No grand celebration. Only a quiet understanding that something meaningful had come full circle. Caleb looked toward the lake through the tall windows. The ice was beginning to break apart near the shoreline. Small patches of open water reflected the afternoon sun. Winter was ending. A season was changing. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the same thing happening to his own life. Spring arrived slowly at Silverpine Lake. The last sheets of ice disappeared from the shoreline, surrendering to clear water that sparkled beneath longer days and warmer skies. Fresh green buds appeared on the pines. Wildflowers pushed through the earth. The entire landscape seemed to awaken after a long season of waiting. The lodge changed as well. Windows that had remained dark for decades now reflected warm light each evening. The old docks were repaired. Fresh paint brightened weathered railings. Laughter returned to rooms that had known only silence. Caleb worked from sunrise until dusk most days, restoring the property one careful step at a time. Yet he never worked alone. Ranger remained beside him through every project, patrolling the shoreline, greeting visitors, and somehow always appearing wherever help was needed most. Word spread quickly through the surrounding towns. People who had once heard only rumors about the lodge now arrived to see it for themselves. Veterans searching for a fresh start. Families facing difficult circumstances. Widows who needed a peaceful place to heal. Little by little, the vision James Whitmore had hidden beneath the floorboards began to live again. One afternoon in early May, Caleb stood on the main dock watching sunlight dance across the water. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and lake water through the air. Nearby, several children laughed as they skipped stones across the shoreline. Their parents sat beneath the trees enjoying a peace they had not felt in years. Caleb smiled quietly. For the first time in a very long while, he was not thinking about where he would sleep next month or where his next job might come from. He was thinking about the future. A future he had never expected to have. Eleanor visited often during those months. Each trip seemed to bring more color back to her face. Sometimes she walked the grounds slowly, remembering summers she had shared with James. Other times she sat on the porch with Ranger resting beside her chair while she watched the lake shimmer beneath the afternoon sun. One evening, shortly before sunset, she handed Caleb a small wooden box. Inside rested the gold ring, the same ring that had started everything. Caleb looked up in surprise. Eleanor smiled. "It found its way home because you helped it get there," she said softly. "Now it belongs to the story too." Caleb hesitated. "I cannot take this." "You already have," she replied. "Not because it is valuable. Because you understood what it meant." He carefully closed the box. Neither of them spoke for a while. The sky above the lake glowed with shades of gold, amber, and soft violet. Across the water, loons called from the far shoreline. The sound drifted through the evening air exactly as James had once described in his letter. Months later, a small brass plaque was placed near the lodge entrance. It carried a simple inscription. Built on kindness. Sustained by hope. Returned by grace. Visitors often stopped to read those words before entering. Most never knew the full story behind them. They only felt something peaceful about the place. Something welcoming. Something real. Late one summer evening, after the last guests had gone inside, Caleb sat at the end of the dock while Ranger rested beside him. The lake stretched before them beneath a sky filled with stars. Gentle waves touched the wooden pilings below. In the distance, the lodge windows glowed warmly against the darkness. Caleb reached into his pocket and touched the ring resting there. Not as a possession, as a reminder. A reminder that one honest decision had changed everything. Somewhere behind him, the lights of the lodge reflected across the water like small beacons shining into the night. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward them before settling back down with a satisfied sigh. Caleb smiled. The lake had finally returned what it borrowed. And in doing so, it had given far more than anyone could have imagined.